Hello everyone, Professor Kruzluk here. So today I want to walk through some of the major protest movements of the civil rights era. So um, much of our reading and that we'll talk about next week explains why they occurred when they did. But for today, I want us to understand more of what happened. So the readings the readings that we have lined up, that we've been working through, try to explain why the civil rights movement emerged when it did. But let's take a step back and just talk for now and think about for now what actually happened. So before we introduce political science theory, before we talk about political opportunities or economic modernization, we need to appreciate the sheer scale, intensity, and disruption of the movement. So really, between roughly 1955 and 1968, the United States experienced one of the most sustained and transformative waves of protest in American history. Millions of Americans participated, hundreds of cities were affected, local, state, and federal governments were forced to respond on both sides. So these were not, and this was not about symbolic protest. This was sustained disruption that really reshaped American politics, reshaped national politics. So let's begin with Montgomery, Alabama in 1955. So when Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a segregated bus, it wasn't the first act of resistance, but it was really this cataclysmic event. Black leaders in Montgomery organized a boycott of the city bus system, and for 381 days, black residents refused to ride city buses. People walked for miles, churches organized elaborate carpool systems, domestic workers got up early to find routes to get people where they needed to be. The economic impact of the city was severe. So what makes this event remarkable is not just its symbolism, it's the discipline and the endurance of those who would not ride the bus system. Also, this was not a spontaneous outburst. It was sustained collective action under conditions of intimidation and economic pressure. And it worked. The Supreme Court eventually ruled bus segregation was unconstitutional. But just as important, Montgomery demonstrated something new. Large numbers of ordinary people were willing to participate in coordinated mass action. It showed that segregation could be challenged. Then, in 1960, the movement entered a new phase. 4 students in Greensboro, North Carolina, sat down at a segregated lunch counter and politely requested service. When denied, they refused to leave. This act sparked a wave of sit-ins across the South. Within months, tens of thousands of students had participated in similar protests. They occupied lunch counters, libraries, and public spaces. Many were arrested, many were beaten, some were expelled from school. The sit-in movement did something critical, however. It decentralized protest. It empowered young people. It transformed civil rights activism from localized campaigns into a contagious national movement across the South. It also targeted everyday segregation, the ordinary humiliations of Jim Crow, making injustice visible in familiar public places. So in 1961, activists escalated further with the Freedom Rides. These protesters boarded interstate buses to test federal rulings that had declared segregation and interstate travel unconstitutional. As they traveled through Alabama and Mississippi, they were attacked by a white mob. Buses were firebombed, um, riders were beaten. Local authorities oftentimes refused to protect them. Images of burning buses and bloodied riders were broadcast across the country and across and around the world. Eventually, the Kennedy administration was forced to send federal marshals to protect the riders. The Freedom Rides demonstrate two things. First, that federal law was not being enforced in the South. And second, that protests could create a national political crisis. Then came Birmingham in 1963. Birmingham was one of the most segregated cities in America. Protest organizers deliberately chose it because they expected resistance. And they were not wrong. Police commissioner, the local police commissioner responded to demonstrations with police dogs, high pressure water hoses, these images that we've seen in our school textbooks since we were kids. These brutal techniques were often directed at children and teenagers. The images were shocking across the country. What had been a regional struggle now became a national moral confrontation. Television made it possible to spread these messages and made it impossible for people around the country to ignore. For many Americans, Birmingham was the moment when segregation's brutality became undeniable. So later the same year, over 250,000 people gathered in Washington, D.C. for the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. This was not a small demonstration. It was one of the largest political gatherings in American history. It featured civil rights leaders, labor union leaders, clergy members, multiracial supporters. Martin Luther King Jr.'s "I Have a Dream" speech became one of the defining moments of the 20th century. But beyond the speech, the march demonstrated something politically significant. This movement had national legitimacy and organizational capacity. It was not fringe, it was now mainstream. In 1964, activists turned their attention to Mississippi during Freedom Summer. Mississippi had some of the lowest black voter registration rates across the country. Organizers launched a massive campaign to register voters and establish alternative political structures. The response was violence. 3 civil rights workers were murdered, churches were firebombed, volunteers were arrested. Freedom Summer exposed the extreme measures used to suppress black political participation. It forced national media and federal officials to confront the depths of disenfranchisement in the South. Then, in 1965, Selma brought voting rights into sharp focus. When peaceful marchers attempted to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge, they were met by state troopers who attacked them with clubs and tear gas. Bloody Sunday was broadcast nationwide. Within months, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The sequence is striking. protest was met with violence, with national outrage, and then federal legislation. But the movement did not end there. By the mid-1960s, urban uprisings erupted in cities like Watts, Detroit. Excuse me. Sorry. Sorry. So by the mid-1960s, places like Watts, Detroit, Newark, these were not organized by established civil rights groups. They were often spontaneous responses to police brutality, unemployment, and housing discrimination. These uprisings revealed a deeper truth. Even as legal segregation was dismantled, structural economic inequality remained. The movement had won political rights, but economic justice was still far from realized. So, by the 1960s, the United States had witnessed sustained economic boycotts, coordinated sit-ins, violent confrontations on interstate highways, mass demonstrations broadcast nationally, the largest march in U.S. history at the time, organized voter registration campaigns under the threat of death, and large-scale urban unrest. This was a period of intense disruption. And here is the key question that we'll think about through our political science perspective. Why did this happen when it did? African Americans had endured segregation and violence for generations. The grievances were not new in 1955. So we'll ask ourselves, and our authors will try to help us understand, why did mass mobilization suddenly become possible? Why did protests spread across the South? Why did the federal government finally intervene? And why did major civil rights laws get passed in the 1960s? So we'll read two pieces. McAdam really asks what political opportunities made mobilization possible, and Peven and Cloward ask what economic transformations and disruptions forced elites to concede reform. So that's kind of what we will think about over the next week. We started our discussion thinking about some of the structural inequalities across the country. We looked at the repressive system that existed in the post-Civil War era. Now we spent some time thinking about, okay, what were some of the big movements in the 1960s? And next week we will move into, okay, why now? Why in the 1950s did we start to see this burgeoning, and then in the 1960s, this acceleration of the civil rights movement? Thank you.